An enormously important fight has begun in Florida over the rights of everyday citizens to amend their own state constitution by petition drive. This is how Florida ended up with a higher minimum wage, how it ended up with term limits for politicians. Yet now those very same politicians are trying to eliminate this process entirely. And they're being cheered on by a bunch of big business lobbyists who spend millions of dollars a year on campaign contributions and lobbying, and who know they can't control the voters of Florida the same way they control so many politicians in Tallahassee. We're going to tell you all about this fight coming up. Hello, and welcome to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I am the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics with a particular emphasis on the ways that big business influences public policy in this state. This is going to be just another quick check-in from the end of week one of the Florida Legislature's 2025 legislative session, week one of 9. This is a 60-day session in Florida. And, I got to say, Florida lawmakers not wasting much time. They got straight to what I think is can fairly be characterized as the most important fight of the legislative session this year, and that will be about protecting or denying access to the ballot for everyday citizens of Florida, particularly their ability to amend the state constitution through petition drives. The petition process is incredibly important in Florida. This is how we have gotten amendments passed to raise the minimum wage, to protect environmental lands, to impose term limits on politicians, to restore voting rights to felons who've completed their sentences. All of this stuff was done. The legislature refused medical marijuana, another one that came through a petition drive. All of this is stuff the Florida legislature itself refused to do, and it required voters to take matters into their own hands. And so we alluded to this at the end of the last show. This began Thursday in the Florida House. It held its first hearing on its big ballot initiative bill this year. This is House Bill 1205. And, one thing I'm going to start doing with these podcasts, by the way, is I'm going to throw links to the actual bills into the show notes in case you want to learn more. But House Bill 1205, I think it's fair to say, is designed to effectively end petition drives. And it would do so primarily by creating a whole bunch of additional obstacles to who can collect petitions, what they can do, when they can do it, what they must do in order to successfully turn them in, what they must collect, and then also imposing and increasing all sorts of fines around this process. So exposing anybody who gets involved in a ballot initiative process to the threat of potentially ruinous fines and even in many cases criminal charges if you trip up over some of these kind of intentionally placed obstacles. And the podcast isn't the place to go line by line through a bill or anything like that. But just to give you an example of how extreme House Bill 1205 is, right now, if you're collecting petitions, let's say you're collecting petitions right now. I think there's one in the works to expand Medicaid health insurance to more Floridians, one of the only states in the country that refuses to extend public health insurance to more people. There's a petition drive to put an amendment on the 2026 ballot that would sort of require Medicaid expansion in Florida. If you're collecting signatures for that, you have, when you collect a signed petition, you have 30 days to turn that petition into the supervisor of elections office they've got to validate the signature and make sure it's legit before it gets counted. House Bill 1205 would cut that from 30 days to 10 days. So they're basically cutting the amount of time you have to turn petitions in by 2/3. But at the very same time, this bill dramatically increases the potential fines you could face for turning a petition in late. And we're not talking about just a little bit of inflationary increase. The maximum fine for turning a petition late will jump by 50 times over, a 50-fold increase. So you're cutting the amount of time people have to turn in petitions, and then you're jacking up the potential fines they pay if they're a day late when they turn one of these things in. That is all, of course, intentional. It is designed to work in a way that, again, chills you out of wanting to collect petitions in the first place. And if that doesn't work, then exposing you to just potential financial ruin if you try and engage in this process. House Bill 1205, like I said, it had its first hearing in the very first week of session. I think it was Thursday, and we're less than a week into session, and Florida House Republicans were already shutting down public testimony. There was an overwhelming turnout of folks opposed to this legislation, and of course, House Republican leaders, rather than, scheduling enough time to actually hear from people, told people first they had only 3 minutes to testify each. They cut it all the way down to 1 minute, and then they just cut it off entirely because they were basically sick of hearing from people. It's like claiming that you don't have time when you're on day 3 of a 60-day session is just a laughable lie. So that bill passed. I think it went through that committee on a 14-4 vote. Interesting to note, there was a Democrat that voted for that bill, a guy by the name of Jose Alvarez, who's a freshman Democratic legislator from Kissimmee, Orlando area, where I am. So probably would like to hear more about his logic for that. But that is just the start. Next week on Monday afternoon, the Senate is going to start moving on its version of this same bill. And we just got this. Part of the reason I'm recording this late is the Senate this morning, or right around lunchtime maybe, released its version of the ballot initiative bill this year. And so I wanted to read that before hopping on this podcast to talk about it. And it is, I am sad to say, even worse, I think, than the House bill. So the Senate bill, which is Senate Bill 7016, and this is going to be heard Monday afternoon in the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee. And again, I'll post a link to the bill, and you can find, if you click on that link, you can find lots of information about where it'll be heard up. You can click all your way through to the committee if you want to reach out to senators, that sort of thing. But Senate Bill 7016 would do almost all of the bad things that House Bill 1205 would do, including the cutting the time you have from 30 days to 10 days, while also like exposing you to these insane fines if you're turn something in on day 11. But it would go even further. And I don't want to run through like the entire laundry list. These are 50-page bills with a bunch of changes in them. Again, all designed to create what I think the academic nerds call administrative burden, right? All this red tape and obstacles that are meant to trip you up if you're trying to engage in this process. Basically the Senate bill, in addition to doing almost all of the bad things the House bill would do, it would require people voluntarily collecting petitions to also register with the state as if they were a paid petition gatherer. This is going to be a chilling process all on its own, and including it will now require anybody collecting petitions to go through a state-mandated online training. And let's just maybe for a second talk about the state of Florida's reputation when it comes from making Floridians go through online processing systems for things that it and the big business lobby doesn't like. If you're anybody out there who's ever tried to file an unemployment claim in Florida on our built to fail unemployment processing system, you could sort of imagine what might be in store for anybody who wants to collect a petition in support of, raising the minimum wage or protecting abortion rights. This seems like an obvious attempt to just sabotage this stuff right from the beginning. In addition to sort of requiring people to even volunteers to register as petition circulators, this Senate bill would prohibit anybody sponsoring an amendment from paying petition gatherers based on the volume of petitions they gather. Like you couldn't pay someone, I'll pay you $100 an hour for, if you collect 50 petitions an hour, I'll pay you $100 an hour. So anything that would be linked to the number of petitions you're collecting would be illegal, which is just, again, designed to make it harder and harder for groups to successfully find enough people to gather petitions. It would also allow any voter in Florida to file a lawsuit challenging a ballot initiative election. This is straight out of the anti-Amendment 4 playbook from last year, where Amendment 4 was the amendment that would have overturned the state's near total abortion ban. And if you recall, just before the election, there was an attempt by some anti-abortion advocates using a former Florida Supreme Court justice as their lawyer to try and get it stricken from the ballot or invalidated if it had passed. There was no real mechanism for that. The whole lawsuit was really scuzzy to begin with. There was no like legal basis for bringing something like that. Ultimately didn't matter because Amendment 4, the Abortion Rights Amendment, didn't pass. It got 57% of the vote, but as much as Donald Trump did, but that was not enough to pass in Florida because constitutional amendments require 60% support. And I think we alluded to this on last time, but that's also a reminder that like the process to gather signatures and get a measure onto the ballot and pass it in Florida is already incredibly hard. Among other things, you have to collect 1 million signatures, and then you have to get 60% of the vote. And that's on top of all these other obstacles that already exist in law, because this is a process the legislature has been making harder and harder and harder for 2 decades now. And I want to tell you, like, The context of this, the reason it seems to be happening this year is there's a bunch of Florida legislators that are like freaked out by last year's election where Amendment 4, the abortion rights amendment, got 57% of the vote, came this close to passing. And also Amendment 3, which would have legalized weed completely in Florida, also came very close to passing. I think it got 55% of the vote. So there's a bunch of people that are freaked out by that and want to shut this process down before Floridians ever get another chance to vote. But well, that I think is kind of like the immediate cause of why suddenly this session we're going back to this well and trying to make this process even harder. But it's important to remember that like the one group that most wants this, the group that is actively right now buttonholing legislators in meetings trying to get them to commit to voting for this bill, is the state's big business lobby. One of the groups that testified for House Bill 1205 on Thursday was the Florida Chamber of Commerce. That is the front group for some of the state's biggest corporations. We're talking about companies like Publix supermarkets, like Florida Power and Light, like the big sugar companies, U.S. Sugar Corp and Florida Crystals. The Florida Chamber of Commerce essentially exists to do their dirty work. These are companies that spend literally millions of dollars a year on campaign contributions and millions of dollars a year on lobbyists in the Florida Capitol. They hate the citizen initiative process for one reason, because they have the Florida legislature under their thumb and they know that they can control the vast majority of Florida legislators, but they also know they cannot control all Florida voters, right? So they want to cut off any avenue around the Florida legislature and make the one place where they have the most political power and the most influence, where they buy the most influence, they want that to be the only place that people can achieve any sort of change so they can pick and choose what actually happens in Florida. This is disgusting. Like I said, this is as far as I'm concerned, the biggest fight of session. And so, again, Senate Bill 7016, the Senate bill, we'll put a link into in the show notes, but that is up Monday in the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee. So, it is somewhat alarming just how closely aligned these bills already are. This feels like something the legislature is going to do something here. But, if you are opposed to this sort of thing, if you want to sort of preserve the rights of everyday citizens to try and enact change themselves and go around an intensely gerrymandered, corporate captured legislature, then I would encourage you to reach out to your legislator and every legislator you can, particularly, over the next few days on the Senate Ethics and Elections Committee. So anyway, that was, I think, by far the biggest development of the first week of session, the fact that they're moving already on this stuff. We'll probably end up talking a lot more about this over the course of session because of how important I think this is. But just to run through a few other things, the Senate continued moving on a really interesting bill, Senate Bill 7002, and this involves the state's water management districts. The state has 5 water management districts that, these are big, powerful agencies. They're run by political appointees of the governor. They levy hundreds of millions of dollars in property taxes. They pay for like flood control projects. They do flood control projects. They administer consumptive use permits for companies and developers and homeowners that withdraw water from the aquifer, drinking water. So, but the context of this bill is really interesting because it is particularly focused on Everglades restoration, the multi-billion-dollar, multi-decade state and federal effort to restore the Florida Everglades, which on the state level, the state agency that kind of leads that process is one of the water management districts, the South Florida Water Management District. And so Senate Bill 7002 would impose like a bunch more legislative oversight on the water management districts generally, but the South Florida Water Management District and Everglades restoration specifically. And this is an interesting bill in that, we've talked a lot about on this podcast lately about how the legislature has been reasserting itself and against Governor Ron DeSantis after being kind of a meek, sort of submissive partner for the last 5 or 6 years to the governor, and basically allowing him to do whatever it wants. The legislature is starting to reassert itself in various ways and impose its will, just sort of ignoring some of the governor's requests and reeling in some of the power they've given him. And Senate Bill 7002 kind of falls within that. Like it imposes like new transparency requirements, reporting requirements on these water management districts. It's going to give the legislature more veto power over water management district budgets. I think probably the most important thing here is, it would give the legislature the ability to veto any construction project a water management district engages in that the legislature doesn't like, basically. And all of this in isolation is not necessarily bad. It's not, the water management districts, like I said, these are powerful agencies. They're run almost entire. They're run by gubernatorial appointees. We have seen, I'm in Central Florida in Orlando, and our water management district, the St. Johns River Water Management District. We've had lots of problems there with the political appointees running that place just being rife with conflicts of interest and like having no business being in a position of power like this. So trying to impose some good government reforms and oversight and transparency of these things, I think is generally a very good thing. The interesting thing about this bill is the context it's occurring in you know, um, is the Everglades stuff. Is there have been for years clashes between particularly Everglades activists and clean water advocates and the sugar industry over water control projects down there and what to do with water, how much water goes south to the Everglades to try and restore some of the natural flow versus how much gets reserved for the sugar industry to use in irrigation. And this is one of those areas. I don't think there are too many people that are harsher on Ron DeSantis's governing approach over the last 4 years than I have been. But he has generally, for the most part, been pretty good on Everglades issues specifically when it comes to sort of choosing between the needs of the sugar industry versus the needs of Everglades restoration. He has, for the most part, pretty consistently chosen Everglades restoration, whereas the sugar industry has a lot of influence in the Florida legislature. I don't think anybody would deny that. And so this is a really, kind of ominous place for the Florida legislature to suddenly be exerting, reasserting itself. There's many other places I would sure love to see you rein the governor in different ways. But the fact that they're picking this place in particular is definitely, it feels, like I said, it feels ominous. But you know what? The bill itself is pretty good. I think the changes it makes are either good or benign or neutral as far as I'm concerned. So as long as Senate Bill 7002 sort of stays like this, I think it's a fine piece of policy. It is just politically perhaps the most interesting bill of session because it's got all the feeling of like, boy, that is a really nice sculpture of a horse right there. Yeah, sure, bring it on inside. I hope there's nothing inside it, And so I think that'll be one to watch all the way through session. Anyway, that is moving. That is on a fast track through the Florida Senate. They've already put it through two committees, and we're just finished the first week of session. The only other bill I was going to mention from this week that I think was interesting, and I just wanted to flag it as like a little example of how much stuff happens in Tallahassee, and every bill is interesting in different ways. There's a bill that went through committees in both the House and the Senate, and I think I don't have the bill number in front of me, but I want to say it's Senate Bill 620. Oh yeah, I do have it. Senate Bill 628 and House Bill 289. And this is it's a boating safety bill, right? Seems fine. It creates a bunch of penalties or increases penalties around fleeing the scene of an accident in a boat. Like if you cause an accident and then you boat away, it has to do with like increasing penalties around this. But you sort of like peek inside that bill, and one of the other things it does is it continues to expand on this idea of fetal personhood. It essentially adds to the crime of vessel homicide, killing a fetus or an embryo. So if you cause a boating accident that causes a pregnant woman to lose her pregnancy, you can now, under this bill, that would create vessel homicide here. And this is all part of, we've talked about fetal personhood in the context of this is a big push in Florida. It has been over the years, but it is gathering steam. There's a more explicit fetal personhood bill that's been filed and appears to be on the fast track this legislative session. And, the reason this stuff matters is if you care about abortion rights, this fetal personhood stuff is really dangerous because it becomes a legal argument used to support any kind of abortion bans and other abortion restrictions. And so it's just an example. This is like a boating safety bill, right? And generally speaking, most of what it does is, I think, will be overwhelmingly supported. I think this bill, when I was reading about it, comes out of like what sounds like a truly tragic situation. But slipped inside there is some anti-abortion stuff, and you just kind of find that kind of stuff all over the Florida Capitol if you read enough bills, basically. Okay, we will wrap it up there. Just a quick looking ahead. So, like I said, this was the first week. Next week, though, things really start to pick up. It's not just the Senate sort of taking aim at killing the citizen initiative, ballot initiative process, but we're going to start to see bills move next week that will weaken the state's minimum wage. Speaking of citizen initiatives, the only reason Florida has a higher state minimum wage than the federal one is because of citizens initiatives. In fact, we talked earlier about how Florida constitutional amendments in Florida have to get 60% of the vote. That is a direct legacy of the corporate lobby, the Florida Chamber of Commerce, Publix, Disney, all those guys getting an amendment passed to raise the threshold from 50% to 60%. And they did that because they were pissed off that voters had passed a minimum wage amendment. That's where that came from. Irony of all ironies, the 60% amendment did not get 60% of the vote, but it still passed because, welcome to Florida. Anyway, legislation to weaken the state's minimum wage is going to start moving next week in the Senate. We've also got this just grotesque anti-competitive corporate tech bill coming out of the state's agriculture commissioner that's meant to stop Beyond Beef and oat milk from using milk or meat on their labels, essentially trying to protect the incumbent meat and dairy industries from competition. Listen, oat milk is awesome. I don't think anybody needs a law to tell them to understand that it's not dairy milk. The oat kind of signifies that. So I don't know why we need to use the power of the state to try and protect the dairy industry in a way that tries to control the words that competitors can use on their packages. There's also a bill's going to start moving in the Senate that would gut funding for legal aid. This is being pushed by a number of banks that want to pay lower interest rates on the accounts that fund legal aid programs in Florida. We've written about this on the podcast or on the newsletter. I'll throw a link to that story in the show notes in addition to the bill. Another bill that we've written about is moving. This is a bill for the Mosaic Company, a big phosphate mining and fertilizer manufacturing company. It would essentially give the company protections from lawsuits over potential contamination on previously mined land. That actually went through its first hearing in the House already this week. I think we talked about it on the last show. That's going to get its first hearing in the Senate next week as well. So that's a bill that is clearly on the fast track, which, one of the things about Mosaic is a number of years ago, I spent a lot of time digging into a ghost candidate scheme that was orchestrated in part by a number of political consultants, who it turned out were involved in a whole bunch of election and lobbying related schemes, like following people, having private eyes follow people, that sort of thing. And it has always stuck with me that the consultants at the time had some of the consultants involved in that had three main clients in Florida at the time: Florida Power and Light, the state's largest utility company; Florida Crystals, one of the state's two big sugar companies; and Mosaic. So that gives you an idea of how just deeply and aggressively engaged in Florida politics Mosaic gets. So this bill, which is essentially to help the company develop its formerly mined lands, that's going to start moving in the Senate next week too. I'll throw a link to the story we wrote about that legislation in our show notes as well. Okay, I've already talked a lot longer than I expected, so we'll cut it off there, and we'll see you again next week. Just as a quick reminder, if you're watching this on YouTube, please make sure to like and subscribe, and leave a comment if you're so moved. And then if you're listening to us, maybe subscribe to the channel, leave a review. And if you haven't already, also just think about signing up for the newsletter. The easiest place to find us is at seekingrentsfl.com. Subscriptions are free. None of our stories or podcasts are behind a paywall, nor will they ever be, but there is an option to voluntarily pay for subscription if you got the means. Please think about doing that if you can afford it. Okay, we'll be back again early next week. Take care.